So this is going to be partly related to a couple of answers I got from the Human Highlander on the last video, and just some thoughts of my own to close it out. And it's embarrassingly late, just so you know, this one, because I'm rolling dice with pretty much every upload attempt I make these days, because the technology, my technology, has been failing me as of late, even more so than before. Anyway, a link to Highlander's answers, all very straightforward and to the point, which I knew it would be. But he was a bit puzzled as to why I asked some of the questions, so I'll just clarify that as well. I did have 11 minutes to paraphrase my questions, and it still wasn't enough time for me, obviously. There was a pertinent part of the video left out after the 11-minute mark, but that's me for ya. I do always manage to take my time for some reason. But the concepts we're dealing with, it is rather important to describe them to a T. And I'm just so sick and tired of being sick and tired of this 11-minute restriction bullshit. So anyway, start things off. I'll just get into this idea that if we the people cared, and this is again operating under that premise that the wealthiest people in the world have gained massive influence over the political arena through their organization. But if the masses only cared to identify the basic issues and thereby familiarize themselves with those, they would be able to use their influence, seeing as how we would have a real democracy as a result, and we would presumably ultimately have all the necessary tools to elect people who are honest enough not to be susceptible to corruption, be it corruption by way of greed or threats against their well-being or what have you. And in some of his previous videos, the Human Highlander's descriptions of the roles that governments play mirrored that of an anarchist's descriptions, at least to me. Only difference being was that, unlike the anarchist, Highlander obviously believes that choosing the state is still choosing the lesser of two evils, but still beats the chaos and all the jargon associated with it. But there was this aura around his message that an inherent part of any random government's roles, it was to restrict the rights of its citizens. I should say unjustly restrict the rights of its citizens. It's an important part. And I just see some incongruity with that and the former. Because, say we open source everything. Just make all information available to the public, along with having control as voters, obviously. Impose accountability on every single government representative. Remind them that they work for us. Don't allow any of this, don't allow them to get away with giving themselves immunity. None of that shit. We can actually come to a point where we wouldn't have to refer to this state or no state dichotomy as just a choice between the lesser of two evils. No, we'd actually be able to say that there's no inherent negative baggage that comes along with choosing the state. And I'm not saying that we're anywhere near that point currently where we can accomplish this, obviously. But in the long term, is it possible? If people start listening up and get motivated enough to make it possible, would that be enough? Would that motivation be enough to create a damn near perfect governing system? Or is that too idealistic no matter what? And you can all chime in on this one, really. I'd actually be quite curious to hear where someone like Remy stands on this, given his libertarianism. Can we do it? Or is there just absolutely no way to avoid shady business in government, regardless of how well we set it up? It's just a question that I've never heard asked on here, at least not with this kind of loaded pretext. So moving on. My second question dealt with the results of God belief throughout recorded history. And it's not really a question because recorded history speaks for itself. But Highlander believes, as the majority believes, that organized religion is really the root of this issue, while I see it as sort of a which one of these came first and thus created the other. What's the one common catalyst every single organized religion in the history of human imagination has? It's God belief. That's what causes it. Without that, you have no pathway to organized religion. And no, I'm not saying that every God believer automatically causes some kind of practical harm to someone. And yeah, there would definitely be other versions of organized crime and mind control out there, had it never been for the notion of, the big fella. But there would certainly be plenty less of it. See, because when you're capable of having a firm belief in something that is 100% unverifiable, and when that same exact belief tickles the heartstrings, not the objective moral machine strings, but the subjective preference and prejudice heartstrings, which is undeniable that this is what God belief does for most people, the heartstrings. And we're talking about the overall result of it. So when one is capable of this kind of belief, they would, in all likelihood, it would just spell disaster. Because the believer will use God to justify with what needs to be justified. Because we know that the believer is, generally speaking, not the type of person with enough integrity to humiliate the natural prejudices out of their belief system. No, the believer is the kind of person that would embrace it. Because if the believer had the necessary amount of integrity to humiliate it out of his system, that same integrity would also crop up and prevent them from firmly believing in something that's completely unverifiable in the first place. So this idea that believers do what they do because organized religion has butchered God is a joke. The suicide bomber isn't screaming out the name of, his local church seconds before he hits his target. No, he's screaming out the name of his fucking God that he believes he's going to meet up with and spend an eternity with. The God. And, say the abortion clinic bomber. He's not thinking about Father Pastor Kearney while he's doing his bidding. No, he's thinking about doing God's work, God's will, because it's all about God. So it's very clear that a spiritual God belief, as the majority of human beings have displayed it, is the root of the problem. It's the catalyst. And the idea that the fault lies solely within organized religion, it's just a comforting lie. And it's clearly why so many people believe it. So, moving on. Let's see. So you were taken aback a bit by my assumption that a 5-star rating equals an endorsement in your book. And you brought up an example about how you 5-starred every video that in the exchange that Gary and I had a while back. But the difference is that exchange we had was, it strictly dealt with the issues at hand. And we weren't diverting anywhere. It was a clean exchange. And I'm sure you recall last year, Gary had a friend by the name of Andy Clark, a guy who 5-starred some of the Hitler Photoshop nonsense. Not because he agreed that Gary had Hitler-esque tendencies or anything, but because he just found it funny. He subjectively enjoyed the colors on the drawings and felt that the videos needed to be rewarded with some stars. But in the end, he still had on his channel a 5-starring of a video that attacked someone for astonishingly cheap reasons. And Gary blocked him over it. Now, I'm not particularly fond of blocking, but I am fond of offering a different perspective to people regarding how some of their activities come off. The idea that it's immature to be amused by an 8-month-old rant from which absolutely nothing bad came out of is just a desperate enough of a tactic to be equated to Photoshop. So, yeah, hopefully you're no longer surprised as to why I bothered asking why I asked that question. And a woman can rant and rave. I mean, society is filled with women who prove the contrary. And to those whose sensibilities are still offended by it, they're obviously not offended by the ranting itself, but by who the rant is coming from, which just speaks volumes of their lack of respect for Martin Luther King's principle of judge a man not by the color of his skin, but by the content of its character. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm probably over time by this point. Once again, surprise, surprise. I always forget to look at the damn time before I start these things. But anyway, not to risk going over time, I will bid you farewell, good sir.